Today is Saturday, February the 9th or something like that. And we're here at my house, Cal Goff's house, doing an interview for the Gay Spirit Visions Oral History Project. And the interviewers' names are Cal Goff and Randall Kumba. And we're going to start. So could you tell us your name and where you live and about how long you've lived there?
Okay, well, I'm Bruce Tidwell. My fairy name is Dandelion, and my friends most all call me Dandy, and that's sort of social as well as pagan name.
Mm-hmm.
I was born and raised here in Atlanta. My family's been here for generations and generations. Right now, I live down in Morrow, Georgia, actually in the house where I grew up, but I've only been there for about 2 years.
Okay. So, what about telling us about a little more about where your grandparents were from and where your parents are from?
Okay, well, my mother's side of the family, my mother's father's side of the family, had land in Jonesboro back in the 1830s, before Atlanta was even Atlanta. All of my great-grandparents lived here. My mother's parents moved here in 1900. That was probably the most recent branch of the family to come to Atlanta. Mm-hmm. And I've spent pretty much my whole life here. I have gone away a couple of years twice to go to college. And then a couple of years ago, I went away for a little over a year. I thought I was going to relocate, but it didn't work out, so I'm back home again. So.
Okay. When were you born?
Oh, 1963.
Okay. Here?
Here,
okay.
Yes. Georgia Baptist Hospital.
Oh, okay. And do you have any siblings, and how many? And
Yeah, I have 2 younger brothers. One 2 years younger and one 7 years younger.
Okay.
And one of the youngest one is married, and I have 2 nephews, both boys.
Uh-huh.
The other one never got married. He's actually engaged. He's going to get married next spring.
Uh-huh. Are they in the area?
Yeah, they're here.
Okay.
I actually live with him he's mostly living with his girlfriend now, but he inherited my parents' house. Mm-hmm. That's the house I live in now.
Okay. Okay, and then just kind of a sketch of your partnership history.
Actually, well, I've had one long-term relationship. Actually, Raven Wolfdancer, who started Gay Spirit, was the first man I would consider to be a lover, although we were together for a year and a half. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I dated a couple of people, and then got together with a man named Frank, who I was with for 12 years. And that ended, and since then, there hasn't really been anybody. That's about 10 years ago.
10 years ago, okay.
So I've pretty much been single,
Okay. And this last piece of the general background question is to tell us a couple of experiences from your childhood that you believe have had a profound effect on either on your values or your personality or the things you're passionate about or the person that you are today.
I would say, honestly, the greatest gift my parents gave me was that I was brought up with almost no gender expectations at all. And I don't think that was really so much a conscious, political decision on their part as much as it was that both of them had very oppressive childhoods. And they wanted me and my brothers to grow up just very free, So I remember when I was about 10 years old, my mother asked what I wanted for my birthday. And I said, well, I want a dollhouse, a big Victorian dollhouse. Later on, I would go get a degree in interior design, and I think that was probably the big thing was that I was, getting into houses and furniture and stuff. Mm-hmm. But then I immediately backtracked and said, but, of course I can't have a dollhouse. And she was like, well, absolutely, if you want a dollhouse, you will have a dollhouse. I said, well, street cred and all that. It's like the other boys in the neighborhood aren't going to like this. And she said, well, what the other boys in the neighborhood think is totally irrelevant. You don't have to worry about them, And I talked her out of it, because I realized what the other boys in the neighborhood thought really did kind of matter.
Yeah.
But when I got older, I just sort of grew up very blissfully naive about who I was. All the men in my family were intellectual, professional people, so there was no fishing, hunting, butch, stuff going on, and like I say, none of them put any limits on me or made demands on me. So it was becoming a radical fairy later on, which led up to being a part of GSV, was actually a very natural thing for me. Unlike some guys for whom it's like this sort of cathartic revelation, for me it was just a whole new expansion of who I already was. I think spiritually, we started out, my mother's family was Anglican, very high church Episcopal, and we started out in that church, but then mostly for just social reasons, my parents switched over to a Baptist church, which became fundamentalist. It wasn't fundamentalist when they started going there, but this was like the mid-70s, and that was becoming a thing, and their church was one of the ones that moved in that direction. Eventually we left because my parents decided it was having a very bad effect on me because I was taking it way too seriously. But I think that was, in a way for me, spiritually, that was a defining thing, in the sense that, at least back then, in the church that I went to, people were really serious about their spirituality and about their faith. And later on we went to a Presbyterian church, and I just told my parents I wasn't going to go back to the Presbyterian church at a certain point when I guess I was a senior in high school, because we started studying Revelations. And at the Baptist church, I had gotten into the whole millennial, end of days, all this sort of stuff. And I sat there for several weeks, and the teacher was just sort of tossing Bible verses like a salad, without really doing anything. And so I spoke up and told her what it all meant, at least what it all meant to me. And several other kids in the class laughed at me. And the teacher didn't stop them from laughing at me. And I went home and I said, if they had a different opinion to share, I could respect that. But the idea that they have no opinion, and they're not forming any opinion, and yet they're, it's okay for them to laugh at my opinion, I'm just not going to put up with that. And there were a number of things, while I was a Baptist, that were very profound spiritual experiences for me. I think one of them, in the Baptist church, you get saved, and then you go down to the front of the church and ask to be baptized and join the congregation and whatnot. And getting saved, I guess I was naturally just spiritually oriented, because there again, when I got saved, I was watching TV, this gospel singing show on TV, and they would always stop in the middle and do this whole get down on your knees and put your hand against the TV screen, and and I'm sitting there, and it was just very intellectual. I was like, wow, I haven't gotten saved yet, and this is something I should do. I know the Bible says I should do it, so I guess I should do it. So I'm sort of like, well, Jesus, at this point I'm like 9 years old. I'm like, I don't really know that I've done all that much sinning, but if I have sinned, I'm certainly sorry I sinned, and please save me. And my parents get up and I tell them, and my mother's like, well, the next thing is, when they have the altar call, you go down to the front of the church and talk to Brother Thompson about it, the pastor. And, so I'm all excited, and, it gets to that moment, and I have stage fright.
Oh.
I can't get up and go down in front of all these people. So this goes on. Well, I go home, I tell my parents. My mother says, well, when Christians have a problem, they pray about it, so she sits down with me, we pray about it. I'm thinking, it's all done, next Sunday comes along, it's like, I cannot get up in front of all these people, And it's like years later, I went back to that church after we had stopped going there and everything, and walked into, this gigantic cavernous, sanctuary, and it was actually incredibly small. It seemed like the size of a football stadium when I was 9 years old, and it was really not,
Uh-huh.
But anyway, so this went on for several months, and finally I just said, well, Lord, I'm ready when you are, but you've got to get me up in front of these people. And there was always where our choir was very important. I mean, very talented. It had a big reputation, So every Christmas they would have a big musical Christmas show, and people would come from all over to see it.
Were you in the choir?
No. I was in the choir for a while, and then I got sort of gracefully kicked out of the choir because my voice changed and I wasn't singing so well anymore. But and this was the adult choir that would do the big show, but that night, the sanctuary was like packed. It was literally, there were men standing in the back, let the ladies have the seats, and extra chairs set up wherever they could fit them in. And so anyway, they get to the altar call, even though it was just basically a musical evening, and the preacher comes down, and he's like, everybody turn to, page 130, whatever, And so I stand up, and we start singing Just As I Am. And like halfway through the second verse, I felt like a bucket of champagne was dumped over my head. And the next thing I knew, I was standing in front of the church. And I walked, people were not falling out in the aisle screaming, some angel didn't carry me, but it was, that was the first of a number of just like profound spiritual experiences that left me not having any doubts at all. It was like there's something, even though my definition of what was out there changed over the years, it was like, absolutely, there's no question there's something out there. So we went through being Presbyterian, we went through being Unity Christian, which is a sort of very, very New Age sort of Christianity. They sold tarot cards in the church bookstore at the Unity Christian Church, which eventually led me and my mother to being New Age pagans, because we just sort of slowly drifted in that direction. I think when I eventually bought a sterling silver pentagram that I started wearing, and when it came, I bought it from some mail order company, and when it came and I was sitting there, that was the moment that I stopped being a Christian, because I'm sitting there holding that, about to put it on, and I thought, it's false advertising. There was no doubt about putting the pentagram on, but it was like, can I really, all these other people that I have known over the years, all those Christian friends and whatnot,
How old were you then when you got
I
there?
was around 20.
Still living at home? Or been to college already?
That was probably while I was in college, I think. I spent 6 years to get my bachelor's degree because I went to junior college for 3 years and then university for 3 years.
Did you live at home to go to junior college?
Yeah, I lived at home to go to junior college. Went off to Athens to the University of Georgia for the rest of it. My father told me to get as much education as I wanted, and so I took, at the junior college, I took almost every single elective in the liberal arts curriculum. I was studying art, and my art teacher was absolutely livid because I was supposed to be in the studio painting, and I was off taking piano lessons and introduction to psychology, introduction to psychology, introduction to philosophy, it's like everything, and he's like, focus.
Focus, even though college is supposed to be.
Yeah, but so we, we became pagans, and that sort of led up to when I got into college. I came back to Atlanta and got into the gay community, and people started saying, are you a radical fairy? And I had no idea what it was. And I was like, well, no, but, what, why, And none of the people were actually fairies. They were people who had seen them at the gay pride parade, or they had had a friend who was, or, their roommates had dated one or something, It was just, well, I don't really know all that much about it, except you seem like you should be. Mm-hmm. And so I found an ad for the Atlanta Fairy Circle in one of the weekly newspapers in the organizations section with a phone number, and I started calling, and not getting any answer. And it turned out that this guy Wayne was in charge of the phone number at that point, and evidently he was not managing it very well. And also I think the fairy circle at that point was sort of a little bit on and off again anyway. So anyway, then I met Raven Wolf Dancer, and we became boyfriends, and I would say lovers. For a year and a half, I spent every single weekend from Friday night till Sunday night in his house. Mm-hmm. We met at a party. I had gotten into the gay theater troupe, and we did a play, and he came to see it. And after it was over, Franklin Abbott introduced us. I was going to his healing circle on Sunday afternoons at the Existentialist Church. Mm-hmm. And I actually don't remember meeting Raven that night. Mm-hmm. Supposedly, he stroked the side of my cheek and told me I was beautiful, mm-hmm. and I have no memory of it at all. But a couple of months later, one of the other guys in the play, who was a mutual friend of ours, had a New Year's Eve party, and I was there. I was sitting on the sofa, and the front door was across the room, and Raven walked in with about 5 or 6 other people, although it was obvious that some of them at least were together, and he had just sort of come upstairs with them, Mm-hmm. But, he walks in, he's dressed all in black, and all this time I had heard about people saying auras and stuff, and I had never even come close. And Raven walked in, and it just, he looked like he had his own private invisible spotlight over his head. Mm-hmm. He just, glowed. And I'm sitting there, I said, before the evening is over, I've got to meet that man. Mm-hmm. And I was very, very shy. I'm still rather shy, but back then I was painfully shy, and so after that goes through my mind, I'm like, wow, you're being frisky this evening, okay, it was the strangest thing. He went off into the dining room to the left, and would have had to come back across the room in front of me to sit down next to me. I don't know how he did it, because I'm just sitting there, enjoying the party. All of a sudden, I feel his hand on my knee, and I turn, and he's sitting there, and he says, "Hi, my name's Raven Wolf Dancer. I don't want to seem like I'm trying to pick you up, but I am." Mm-hmm. And I said, "Well, that's okay, because I was kind of hoping you would." Mm-hmm. We spent the rest of the evening chatting, mm-hmm. and he invited me over the next Friday night for dinner. And there again, I was like, this little Southern belle again. It's like, if I really like you, I'll kiss you at the end of a first date, Mm-hmm. I ended up staying over. I called my parents the next morning. At that point, I had moved back in with my parents. I called my parents the next morning just to say I was okay, Mm-hmm. And I said, I'll be home later this afternoon. And I called them back and said, well, I think I'm going to stay for dinner, maybe spend the night, Yeah. Called up Sunday morning, well, I'm still okay. Finally, 10 o'clock Sunday night, I finally went home. And that was just, we fell in together. He got me into the fairies. finally. He was one of the first radical fairies in Atlanta. And so he, of course, knew where the circle was meeting and stuff. And, that went on. We eventually broke up because I had also...
Just back up a little bit. Was he living by himself at that point?
Yes.
Was he living on Delta up there by the DeKalb Avenue or some other, or on?
Yeah, he had an apartment in the big Victorian house there on the edge of Inman Park.
Okay, yeah. Oh, okay.
In the back half. He had like the upstairs back half
Mm-hmm.
of this house.
Okay.
And so we broke up because I had started hanging out at the Atlanta Eagle, which is the leather bar. And finally he sat me down and he said, the stuff at the Eagle is something that you really need to explore. I was really ready to marry him. I mean, if he had really given me that notion that he wanted to explicitly declare that we had a permanent relationship, at that point I would have happily given up the Eagle for him, but he said, this is something you have to explore and find out what it means to you, and it's something that I can't go there with you.
Mm-hmm.
You have to do this on your own. And so we broke up, which was very difficult for both of us. And we sat there holding each other, crying for like at least an hour or two, but we stayed very close friends. And I guess it was probably a year or so later, not terribly late, no more than 2 years later, that he called me up and told me that Harry Hay was coming to Atlanta, that they were bringing Harry Hay down here for a visit.
Mm-hmm.
And he had gotten Harry Hay to sign a copy of Gay Spirit, Myth, and Meaning for me and send it to me and everything. So, I knew exactly who he was and was just sort of almost overawed at the idea that I was going to actually get to meet him. Mm-hmm. And what had happened was that the Atlanta Fairies had a land trust called Running Water up in, I guess, North Carolina. But that's somebody else's story to tell, I guess. But it was small, and it got to the point people started building up around it, and it got to the point where, several dozen naked men banging on drums in the middle of the night was, no longer going unnoticed. And so they sold it. And it was a land trust, so there was all this money that I guess should have been divided up between the trustees, I guess. But they all said, well, just do something, useful and charitable with it. And came up with this idea of, we'll have a conference and we'll bring Harry Hay to Atlanta, because it's been like 10 or 12 years, I guess, since he'd been to the Southeast. And so anyway, Raven said, this is happening, and we found this place called The Mountain up in North Carolina, and so we're going to have a retreat. And I said, well, I want to be there more than anything in the world, but I can't afford it. And he said, don't worry about it, just have your bags packed and be ready to go. And so I really don't know whether they gave me a scholarship or whether he paid my way or where that came from. I didn't really, at the time I didn't really think to ask. Mm-hmm. We all went up there. There was probably about 80 men. And, it was just absolutely, amazing. The very last heart circle, we were all sitting there, and we're going around, and I think maybe they saved Harry for last. I'm not sure. Probably I didn't even think about anything after he got through speaking, but, he spoke, and, at that point, he was already old. I mean, he lived another 10 or 12 years later, but I mean, must have been in his mid-60s at least, and so I sort of wonder if he didn't have an awareness of, how much time he had left, because, when he spoke to us at that point, it was very much a passing the torch sort of thing, of, I've sort of done all this, and now it's up to, all your younger people. Of course, basically everybody in the room was a younger person, compared to him. But, but it's up to all of you to take this and run with it and do something with it. And, as I'm sitting there, it just suddenly flashes into my mind. It's like, this is the kind of conversation Jesus must have had with his disciples, coming up on him going, being crucified or whatever. And there was just a very profound sense, for me at least, of an awareness of the privilege of being part of that experience, and being there among, this very small group of people who got to experience this. And of course, none of us, not even Reagan, nobody had any idea that this was going to become anything more than just getting Harry Hay to Atlanta for this weekend. They got back to Atlanta, and of course at that point I wasn't involved in anything else, but looked over the books, and it was like they still had the money. It had all come back in again. So I think Ron Lamb had a charity, a nonprofit that he had set up, and they're awfully difficult to set up. So I'm sure once he got one, he wanted to hold on to it just because it's a nice thing to have around, So they put all the money into the nonprofit, and then the next year he gave them a grant to put on a new conference, and they invited James Broughton to come. So he came and had another wonderful weekend, and by that point there's probably close to 100 people came, and sat down after it was over and looked at the money, and it was like, wow, the money's come back again. I guess it was the third year that it was Raven and Ron Lamb and Rocco Platt were the three men who put it all together. And I guess they realized, this seems to be sticking around, and it's a lot of work. And, I don't think none of them had signed up for this indefinite, project. So they decided to set up a planning committee. And, Raven called me again one afternoon, and he's like, we're turning this whole thing into something, and we're getting together some guys to take over and start putting it together. And I said, well, Raven, I shouldn't be there. I don't have any experience. I just barely into all this. I'm still, I'd have to do the math, I don't remember, in my mid-20s, and he said, well, that's exactly why you should be there, because we need a voice from the guys who are in their mid-20s. This has got to be for everybody, and so I said, well, okay, if you want me to, it was like, anything he wanted me to do, I would have done, and so we started the planning committee, and in the beginning it was, I don't know how it is now, but it was absolutely, totally by consensus. And the first couple of years, I don't even remember that we really had subcommittees. It was just like 12 or 14 guys and it was basically, Raven invited me. I don't know if other guys were specifically recruited. I guess in the very beginning there must have been, but basically it was open to whoever wanted to come help. I think it was sort of encouraged that you go to at least one conference before you join the planning committee, so that you knew what it was all about. But everything was totally done by consensus. Nothing was ever voted on. But consensus on that level is really based on a level of integrity that everybody understands. If it comes down, in a group of 12 guys to one or two people who don't like the decision, then you have to have the integrity to step back and go, okay, I've made my argument. You understand what my concerns are.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't think they're important, then I need to let it go.
Mm-hmm.
You know, either that or get up and leave.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if it's so huge that you just can't stand it,
Mm-hmm.
then you know you don't need to be there anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And it always worked. There were maybe 2 or 3 times that we had people who came that really didn't need to be there. I know there was one time in particular that this guy, you know, joined the committee, and I don't really know what his motive was, but it became very obvious that he was power hungry. He had some reason why he wanted to sort of co-opt the thing and, you know, turn it into his thing or whatever, you know. And there was some conversation behind his back. I mean, you know, what are we going to do about him,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And basically everybody was like, well, let's just let this go and see what happens. And he stayed for about 6 or 8 months, and then he drifted away because he couldn't get any traction.
Mm-hmm.
Because everybody was just like, oh, well, no, that's nice. You know, aren't you special? You know, and going on with stuff, you know, and, you know, and without, you know, he would sort of go around and try to get a coalition, but, you know, that wasn't working, and there wasn't any, like, parliamentary procedure that he could hijack anything, and so it was, you know, he wandered off and did whatever he did.
Mm-hmm.
At some point we started having, dividing things up into subcommittees, just to make it easier.
Mm-hmm.
And they were all consensus as well.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I realized I should have gone back because, you know, my ferry drag later on became a big deal. And that really started, well, I went to my first my first ferry gathering at Short Mountain. And I remember I only took 2 skirts
Mm-hmm.
with me. And I felt oddly enough, I felt somehow wearing dresses and skirts seemed irrelevant to me. I already had a fair amount of women's clothes in my wardrobe, but more or less androgynous clothes,
Mm-hmm.
because I was buying most of my clothes at that point at the thrift store, which I'd started doing in art school because that was the boho thing to do, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I was tiny. I had a 27-inch waist. I wore a men's extra small, so it was far easier for me to find things that I could fit into in the women's department than the men's department.
Mm-hmm.
And because it never really had any significance to me anyway, it was just, okay, that's fine. A pair of pants is a pair of pants,
Mm-hmm.
you know. I think it probably added a subliminal level of androgyny. I was a fairly androgynous looking guy at that point as well, you know. So I think the clothes probably added an extra level of androgyny, but it wasn't ever intended. I never thought of myself as cross-dressing, you know. I intended to pass, you know. But I went to the gathering with these 2 skirts that I bought mostly because I didn't want to end up being the only man in a circle that didn't have a skirt to wear.
Mm-hmm.
And got up there, and they had this little thrift store called Muley's Junk Boutique, and Miss Muley was like this aging middle-aged hippie, pot-smoking hippie lady, you know, who ran this little thrift store, and she would get bales of clothes from just somewhere,
Mm-hmm.
and they were literally like 2 feet by 3 feet by 5 feet tall, you know, 600 pounds, whatever. She had a big carpet in the middle of this little storefront, and she would set them in the middle of this carpet and clip the wires off of them, and they would fall down into a big pile. And you go in and kick your shoes off and grab a plastic laundry basket and wade into this mountain of clothes and just dig through and find whatever. And they were all just like ridiculously cheap. You know, it was like a men's shirt was 25 cents, a pair of pants was 75 cents, you know. A dress might be $1, you know. And it was pretty amazing, you know. At one point, this was probably after I'd been going up there for several years. I went to every spring and fall gathering for almost 10 years.
At Running Water?
At Short Mountain. This was at Short Mountain. I missed the Running Water gatherings.
Okay.
I think they ended a year or two before Raven and I met, so
That's
I never
right.
got to go to Running Water.
That's right. Short Mountain.
One time I was up there, I ended up at the thrift store by myself, and I'm sort of discreetly...
Hold on. This is
Sure.
a thrift store, a regular thrift store in the town?
Yeah, in the town,
Okay,
yes.
in Tennessee.
In Woodbury, Tennessee.
Okay.
Yeah, which is a teeny little town of maybe several thousand people.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and this is like right there on the town square. I mean, there was townspeople went to shop there as well,
Mm-hmm.
And I was about to say one time I ended up by myself. I guess I missed the ride with everybody else, and so, but I had my car, so I went into town. So I'm sort of discreetly digging through the pile since I'm there by myself. All of a sudden, I get hit upside the head by this piece of clothing, and then this lady says, "Oh, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. It's just, it seemed like something you might like." And I picked it up, and it's like this silk blouse, And I'm going, it's like, okay, so much for, so much for discreetly digging through the pile of clothes, I think that was the same day that I went across, because we'd always go to this little country cafe restaurant across the street to lunch. So after I got my stuff, I went across the street, walked in the door, and the hostess says, "Your group's in the back." It's like, okay. But yeah, so I went home from that first gathering with a 30-gallon trash bag full of women's clothes. And
now, is the Short Mountain thing, did it overlap with GSV, or was it before GSV?
It overlapped.
It overlapped.
It overlapped. They bought the farm up there in I think 1982, but it's still going.
Yeah.
It's been going ever since, and they still have gatherings. I don't go anymore because they have 700 or 800 people, which to me is insane. I don't see how they can fit that many people. I was at the first gathering when 100 people showed up, and everybody was astounded that there was 100 people here this year.
So you were going to both?
I was going to
kinds
both of them.
gatherings
Oh yeah,
for a while.
to GSV and the gathering.
And some of them would come to the gathering.
Yeah, some of them would come to GSV. They didn't really like GSV. There was, for a long time there was probably still true that the GSV was the yuppie fairy gathering, which I know Raven at least sort of intended it to be that way. I mean, not to be the yuppie gathering, but to be a radical fairy experience for men who, were either too urban or, not hardy enough to go out and sleep in a tent for 9 days in the middle of the woods and drink well water and, use an outhouse and take cold showers and stuff. It was, to some extent, a pretty arduous experience. Although, no, it was fun.
You think it had more to do with the comfort level or the politics of it? Or or a little of both?
I think probably a little of both, but I think in the beginning it was less the politics. Well, I mean, this I don't want to say split, but the eventual sort of division between the Short Mountain Fairies and GSV had a lot to do with politics, as well as, mostly about politics and money.
And that was early on?
That was after 5 or 6 years or so.
Talk a little more about that. I don't know about that. That controversy.
Yeah, it wasn't really.
I had a personal controversy with it, with the money part, but I didn't know that
it wasn't really so much a controversy as just a little, not even melodrama, but part of it was the fairies at Short Mountain, well, they would have gatherings and for Beltane and then the autumn equinox, and those would bring in lots of people and everything. There were a revolving group of 8 or 10 or 15 guys who lived at the sanctuary all the time, and they would sort of come and go, and it was very, very poor, and I think most of them subsisted on food stamps. There was some craft work going on and stuff, but, and there was always, I think, a sort of political undercurrent of socialism. I mean, not like hardcore socialism, but sort of
communalism.
Definitely hardcore communalism. And so part of the problem was that they sort of felt like that they should get scholarships to come to the GSV conference, because I guess they were sort of the high priest of the Short Mountain Sanctuary, the circle holders of the Short Mountain Sanctuary or something, And so they just kind of felt like they should get a free ride, and we were sort of like, and it was less, from the GSV side, less amount of politics than amount of finances. It was just, we can't afford to give away that many free spots. But they, also, the gatherings were, you just go and you give whatever you can afford to give. It was just contributions. I'm not sure there was even really like an explicitly suggested contribution. It was just pass the hat,
At Short Mountain.
At Short Mountain.
Yeah.
And so that was, to have this other event that is at this, relatively nice convention center, and it costs, $150, $200, it's sort of gone up and up over the years, to go, for them that really was a lot of money. It was a lot of money. And their feeling was sort of, well, you could do this a lot cheaper, and we could all chip in and take over the kitchen and fix our own food and, find a campground somewhere to do this at or something, and so that was irritating for them. So most of them eventually just sort of stopped coming, and I think that was how the whole sort of, GSV is like the yuppie fairies, but
now, were you in the planning group at the same time you were still going to the...
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, all right. And so talk a little more about that planning process. What did it feel real comfortable to you, the way it worked?
Absolutely.
Were you real pleased with that?
It was magic.
Who were some of the people that you remember from that time that you were working with?
Al Cotton and Martin Treewalker Iskanitis, and Gary Kaufman was one of the early people. He dropped out after a while. I don't really know. That would be his story. But who else?
Was Peter still doing things, Peter Kendrick, or did he just come? I can't remember. I know we had an early meeting at his house before the first conference.
Right. I don't...
So there were you and Raven and Al, and I'm trying just to recall some of the other people. Were there other Atlanta people?
Oh yeah, they were all Atlanta people.
Okay.
Pretty much all Atlanta people. I think Ron Lamb and Rocco would sort of drop by, but I mean they weren't there on a regular basis. They were sort of in touch, I'm sure, and sort of, telegraphing their impressions and feelings about things, but I don't remember it. And they may have even, the first couple of conferences that we had planning committees, they may have even sent letters occasionally, with their views on, as we were choosing, keynote speakers and stuff. They may have sent letters and stuff, but it was, I just remember it really was magic. I mean, we were all, every year, just astounded, that we would go through this haphazard process. We would always get down to the last, month or two and be absolutely frantic, because it would seem like that we had done absolutely nothing, and that, we've got weeks before these people show up on our doorstep and we had no idea what's going on. And then all of a sudden, it would just fall into place.
Uh-huh.
You know, and we would all just be sitting there experiencing it with everybody else just going, how does this happen? You know, every year, and it just happens over and over, and it's always so just perfect, you know.
Do you remember if the small groups were invented the first couple of conferences?
No.
I can't remember myself.
No, I don't remember what year it was, but it wasn't. It was the planning committee decided to do that, and if the planning committee started with the third conference, it probably wasn't until like the fifth or sixth conference that we had small groups, I think, because that came about because as it grew, you know, the first couple of years, it was friends and friends of friends, and so a large portion of the people knew almost everybody, you know, pretty much everybody knew at least some people, you know. As it got up to, you know, 120 people, and, you know, and word was spreading out and around about it, we realized that there were people coming who didn't know anybody, or at least maybe knew the one person who had said, you know, you have to come to this. And that could make it kind of alienating for people, you know, because it could be, you know, for a lot of people, such an incredibly powerful experience. And, you know, and we had people realize that we were having, you know, quite a few people who were coming who, you know, at that point had never been in a room with 100 gay men. It was like, you know, if you didn't get to the Pride Parade, there were relatively few places you could go and be with that many gay men in a public space, you know, other than maybe a dance club or something, but everybody is like totally fragmented, you know, but to sit in this circle with this many people, you know. And so that was it. The solution was small groups, that if we had small groups, that would give people a more intimate way to share. It would give them an in-depth connection with other people, that they could hear those things and realize that other people were having those experiences. You could meet somebody so that when you got to the dining hall, you had an excuse to walk over and sit down at the table and say hi because they were a small group member. You know, you knew each other. You know, and so that was kind of where that came from. We came up with the gift giving thing, and that was, yeah, I may be getting a little ahead of myself with that, but that was turned into, I was really honestly against the gift giving ritual. I just felt like it was superficial, and it was a waste of time, and, you know, sort of an imposition on people to ask them to bring things and to spend money on things, although, you know, there was never a price set or anything, you know, but I just didn't really feel like it was necessary, and really realized that became, you know, that was another thing that was just absolute magic. That I don't think I was, you know, ever in a group when anybody was ever disappointed with the gift that they got. And just over and over, these incredible synergies happened. And I think the biggest one, the story that I was going to tell, was actually my first year as a small group leader, which for a number of years I was the sort of MC ritual master person, so I didn't have a small group because I had enough going on and felt like I had way more than enough presence in the weekend and to also be a group leader. But at some point I took on being a group leader, and we got to the gift exchange, which was always Sunday afternoon at the very last group meeting, and usually, yeah, everybody was just asked to bring a gift that was special. It could be something like really personal, like something off of your altar or whatever, but it might be a box of your favorite incense or a copy of a book that you had read that meant something, or whatever. Just bring something special, and you know, and be ready to explain why you brought it, what it means to you, you know. And usually the oldest man in the group would choose first. The gifts would be in the center of the circle, and he would choose a gift. and whoever brought it would explain to him what it was, and then they would choose a gift, and it would go around. And so anyway, this one of the men in my book's group, chooses his gift, and he opens it up, and it's this crystal, very ordinary quartz crystal, about inch and a half long, very cloudy, not a very special one, and so the guy who had brought it starts telling the story, and he had been sexually abused by his father throughout the better part of his childhood, and I think it was like 3 years earlier, from the conference 3 years earlier, he had finally gotten to the point where he was ready and able to deal with it, and had gone into therapy and started facing up to this. And one of the first things that he did was to go out on a sort of vision quest. I'm not sure he used that term, but he went out in the woods for a weekend by himself to just, start opening up these feelings, and was sitting on the edge of this creek and looked down into the water, and there was this crystal. So he picked it up and put it in his pocket, and he had been carrying it for 3 years while he went through this whole process. And now he was at a point where he felt like that he was as healed as he was going to be, and it was time to give it up. But as, a very deeply ritually oriented pagan and the leader of this group, and supposedly, trying to hold the circle, I'm just sitting there silently freaking out. I'm thinking, oh my God, he really should have taken this and put it back in the creek or something, all this energy in this crystal, and now he's going to hand it to somebody else, how is this person going to take it, and what am I going to do, and the guy who had chosen it still gets me choked up, just burst into tears.
Wow.
Sobbing, and and the guys next to him reach out and put their arms around him, and when he got to where he could talk, he said, my father molested me when I was a boy, and last week I went to my first therapy session to start dealing with this.
Wow. Magic.
Yeah, it's like, how? But that's what GSV was about. Those things just happened,
Right. Do you remember if the heart circle was always part of the,
yes.
from the beginning? I don't
Yes,
remember
from
it not
the
being part of it.
Yes.
I don't know how
Yeah,
it got
it was
imported,
the heart circle was always a part of it. I think that was something that came out of the fairies.
Yeah.
The fairies had heart circles.
That's right.
So that was one of the things that was brought over.
Mm-hmm.
So there were always heart circles.
Okay.
And
did we always have altars from the beginning? I can't remember that, whether at the very first we did, but we might have. I don't remember.
I'm not sure about the first year. It was a very early thing.
Mm-hmm.
I know I didn't start the altar thing, but when I sort of became chairman of the ritual committee and doing the rituals and being the MC and everything, they got bigger and bigger. I have a theater background. I started in the youth choir when I was like 7 or 8, and did my first play when I was 12. So, but I mean, it wasn't ever about theater. But I had an understanding of drama and how to create a feeling in a room with that, and so the rituals got more and more complex, and the altar got bigger, and there was a lot more thought put into it, at that point than throughout the whole middle years.
Go back and talk a little bit more about how you became the whatever it was you were doing, the emceeing, or what? I mean, was that for the the bigger gatherings, or was it for the talent show, or was it
for the whole
weekend?
For the whole weekend.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so,
I was sort of
do you remember how that came to be? How you decided to take that on?
Actually, I don't, because that was really considering how modest I felt about myself at that point. That was a big thing. I'm sure it was more or less dropped in my lap.
Was this still when Raven was alive?
Yeah.
He was, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
But I think, part of it was that I was in theater.
Mm-hmm.
I was very, in spite of being horribly shy off stage, I was totally happy to be on the stage.
Okay.
And public speaking was nothing,
Mm-hmm.
And that may have been part of it, that we were sitting around and it's like, well, who's going to take over doing this?
Mm-hmm.
And everybody's like, oh, not me, not no, And I was sort of like, well, I don't mind talking, but, and it was like, yeah, Dandy, yes, you got to do this, and
I don't remember a talent show the first time.
Yeah, I don't think so. I'm not sure when we started having the talent show.
Did you ever do any emceeing of that too? Or was that
No,
a special?
That was always that was always somebody special.
Okay.
I performed during that time. I had started doing sort of performance art monologues. There was a gallery here down in the Old Fourth Ward in Atlanta that would have. They would very, very edgy, alternative sort of art gallery, and they would have shows, I guess, about 4 times a year, and release a word. All the shows were based around a word, and so they would, it was like the cross show. I think there was a queer show. There was the fashion show. There was all these shows, and part of it, the opening night of the show, they would have a cabaret, and so I don't remember how I got into that either, but I fell into being one of the cabaret performers, and so I started writing these radical gay monologues that I would stand up and do. And I think the only one that ever almost went over the edge was about having sex with Jesus. And it was wonderful, because it was called A Memory from My Childhood, and it was this sort of stream of consciousness thing that I get up there and I start talking, and I'm talking about being an adolescent boy and discovering my sexuality, and which segues into realizing that I'm actually gay, and in between I'm reminiscing about this Baptist summer evening revival service, and so it's just sort of drifting back and forth, and then there are all of these stanzas from Baptist hymns that I will break out into song, which happened in these revival services, except everybody knew all the words, so, all of a sudden everybody would be singing, and so anyway, but all the songs were picked with this sort of double entendre meaning going on in it, and until I get right up to the very end, and it's all coming together, and and I've found this guy that I'm in love with, that that I just totally worship, and this all coming together right up to the very, very end, where I sing this verse from "Just as I am," just as I am without one plea, my Savior, I come to thee, and then I reach down and pantomime, jacking off, I say, this is my body, this is my blood, and then I lick my hand and fall down on the floor with, my head, looking up with my hands, It was like, at least half the gay men in the room screamed. This drag queen in the front row says, oh no, she didn't. The straight people just sat there in absolute stunned silence, And so I'm sitting there on the floor waiting for the applause to start so that I can stand up, and there's just like, for like 45 seconds or, finally the minute when the gay men got through, just like screaming, they started cheering, and then the straight people sort of because they were all, a lot of the straight people, well, there were the gay men who would come, there were all the like punk rock kids from 5 Points who would come, and then there were, a significant crowd of yuppies who would come down, sort of from Buckhead. I don't know where they came from, but they were always there because, this was this edgy avant-garde thing to do, And so I sort of saw it as my business to provide them with what they came for. But that night they got a little more than they came for.
Oh, that's funny. I think I remember some monologues that you did early on at the conferences.
Yeah, the biggest one I did was called Pink Taffeta. And it was, well, one friend described it as Dandelion dresses in fabulous drag and talks about gay rights. But it was a rant about gay identity. Back at a time when a public gay identity was still more or less a contested thing.
Yeah.
And that started out with the gay theater group. There was an Outsiders Art Festival that somebody started, and they came to us and they said, well, we want you to do a show for our Outsiders Art Festival, and they got these street people to paint paintings and all this sort of stuff. It was all rather patronizing and politically correct. But so we as a group wrote this ensemble piece, and as near as I can tell, it was built around a committee organizing the Gay Pride Parade. But we had all chosen sort of archetypal gay figures, and we had somebody who was in a wheelchair who was pretending like they were handicapped because we didn't have anybody really, and I was radical fairy and everything.
Oh.
We wrote this whole thing. We sent the outline to the people, and they decided it was too radical for their Outsiders Art Festival, so they wouldn't let us do it.
Ironic.
Yeah, it's wonderful.
After all the work you put into it.
Yeah, but we thought we were.
Excuse me, I'm going to turn the sheet up just a second.
But anyway, I wrote, as a part of that, I wrote a piece about being a radical fairy called "My Pink Skirt," and everybody in the show had a moment where they had a monologue when they talked about their particular person who they were in the gay community. And I was up there at Muley Shunk Boutique with my friend Byron, and he found this absolutely outrageous hot pink taffeta evening gown. It was just like, we could never decide what, there was no place anybody could have ever worn that dress, this huge full skirt with a triple layer of ruffles on it, this off-the-shoulder ruffled neckline. It
sounds like Scarlett O'Hara.
It was, except it was hot pink.
Yeah.
And we walk in and we see it, and Byron is like, oh my God, I have to have that. So we go in the dressing room, and I start trying to zip him into it, and it was a good 6 inches too small, and he's, like, just like with Prissy and Scarlett, it's like, grab them, I'm like, exhale, Byron, exhale. It's not going in. He says, well, one of us is going home with this dress. And so it fit, and so I wore it to one of the parties up there, and Gabby Hayes, one of the other fairies, walks up to me and says, Dandelion, not one woman in 100 could wear that dress, but you look fabulous, So I rewrote this whole monologue as Pink Taffeta, and it starts out, good evening, I'm Dandelion, morning star, I'm a gay man, a flaming faggot, a radical fairy, and I decided to wear a dress this evening. If that's not politically correct, you should know it's not supposed to be. And just goes through all this stuff, I rip into religion, I rip into, standing on a street corner and a couple of rednecks drive by in a pickup truck and yell faggot, and I yell, damn right I am. And it all goes around to it. At the very end, I say something about, but I get tired and I get afraid and I wonder why I keep going on. And then I look, and somewhere there's a man standing there with that look in his eyes. And I go to him, and when I fall into his arms, I remember what love is, what pink taffeta means, what living is for. And I did when I did that at 800 East, it went over really well. A few months later, I did it at Short Mountain, and I got a 10-minute standing ovation with like 6 curtain calls. People wouldn't, and which totally shocked me. I mean, I knew it was good, but it was like, all of a sudden, well, I had to, I suddenly on the fly, I'm like adding pauses for the cheers and stuff in the middle of it. And I get to the end, they didn't stop until I went out and just begged everybody. It was like, there's another half of the show, please. People still come up to me. That was in the late 90s. People still occasionally come up to me and say, I remember the speech you gave in the pink dress. The No Talent show, that came from the ferries, or at least from Short Mountain. I don't know how many other ferries, other places do it, but there was always a talent show at Short Mountain, a no talent show, to make it, to make it, accessible and give people a chance. Although I have to say that is the best theater I ever saw in my life.
Really?
I mean, the people who show up, there's, obviously there's people who get up there who honestly don't have talent and do their thing, and everybody's nice to them, but the amount of talent that is always there is just, I just sit there going, in Atlanta, people would pay $50 a ticket to go to a show like this. Just incredible stuff. And I think it was the same way at GSV too. That there was always an amazing amount of really good stuff that would happen.
I want to backtrack a little bit to ask you 2 questions that precede all of this, probably. First of all, the name, the Dandelion name. How did that come out?
It was
when and under.
It was probably my second gathering.
GSV gathering.
No, my second ferry gathering.
Ferry gathering. Okay. So even before.
I think by the first GSV gathering, I was Dandelion.
Okay.
It really was just a totally natural thing for me. I think, I went to the gathering, and found out that people had fairy names. And of course, like I say, I think at the first fairy gathering, I was sort of like, well, that's interesting. And of course, I've just started this, so, I'm not going to do this quite yet. But I had always loved dandelion flowers. When I was a kid, I loved dandelions. And, I remember saying, if they were difficult to grow, people would grow them in pots in greenhouses because they're so pretty, Later on, I found out the Victorians actually did grow them and put them in flower shows. But, at the time, so, and then as I got older, just the sort of whole idea of dandelions as weeds and stuff was,
Do you remember deciding on it during the conference? Coming
a gathering.
Yeah, or was it? Did you bring it in your mind to a conference?
I probably brought it in my mind.
Okay.
And then there was a moment when I was around 19 or 20. I was suicidal for most of my teenage years. Pretty actively suicidal and desperately depressed. Now I know I'm bipolar, but bipolar 2, I should say. But at the time, I didn't really know. And there was a day when I was in junior college. I was walking home because I didn't live that far from the campus. It was winter time. It was not bitterly cold, but it was chilly and drizzly and awful, and I'd had a bad day, and was feeling really awful, and I'm walking across the athletic field, and there was a dandelion blooming. And this is like January, which is, it happens down here in Atlanta. It was not a total miracle, but that was like the one tiny good thing that had happened that day. And I literally fell down on my knees and promised the goddess that I would not kill myself on a day when dandelions were blooming. And for the next year, every single day I looked, there were dandelions blooming. Wow. One day I walked out on to my deck, and it had snowed the day before, and the snow was melting off into big patches of grass here and there, and in every patch of grass there was a dandelion blooming. So, so when it came time to, think of something, and a lot of fairies choose plants and flowers and stuff, so, although not all, some of them come up with much more esoteric things, but when it came time for me to really think about it, that was just automatic. Yeah, that was.
And what's the morning star part? I don't know that I knew that. When did that happen?
That kind of happened from the beginning. Or no, that may have happened. That had to do with Venus, the planet Venus, which is very prominent in my astrology chart, and which I also, growing up, had just this fascination with the planet, totally so long before I had any exposure to astrology. Somehow just the planet Venus just seemed amazingly romantic, and I didn't know, what, but I don't know whether that came up right in the very beginning. I don't think so. That may have come up. They have the chairman of the board, which I should talk about that in relation to GSV too, but the chairman of the board of the nonprofit that supports the Short Mountain Sanctuary is the Empress of Short Mountain. And so now she's Sister Somai Deluxe, I think, but back then she was Sister Missionary Position, was Empress one year, and she gave me the title of Duchess of Georgia. And so I think that may have been when I went from just being Dandelion to Dandelion Morningstar, Duchess of Georgia.
Oh, I see. There's more. There's a lot of names. Okay.
So,
do you remember when you first introduced yourself that way instead of Bruce Tidwell?
Is Dandelion
in a public place?
Oh, well, that's sort of. Well, I started, in terms of like the gathering and other pagan, because some mainstream pagans have pagan names.
Okay.
So, in pagan places, I started calling myself Dandelion almost all the time, but it didn't really become a big thing until I got on, my lover Frank and I got our first computer, and they had these things called bulletin board services, which was like the precursor to AOL, and guys would like go out and buy 6 or 8 or 10 modems and hook them up, have them in their garage, and then you would log on 10 people at a time onto these little sort of mini AOL things. And we got very heavily into that, and so I needed a computer screen name, and because everybody had screen names, well, I was like, well, I've already got one nickname, I don't really need another one, so I became Dandelion on the computer, and so there was all my pagan friends who called me Dandelion, and all my computer friends who called me Dandelion. I think they were the ones who shortened it to Dandy.
And that was before the fairy circle?
No, that was after the fairies. That was like in the mid-90s. The GSV and the fairies have been going for several years before the computer thing started. And I was Dandelion at the computer conferences. At some point in the late 90s, there were a lot of people who called me Dandy, and I don't remember the first time that, it got to the point where it was, there were still a lot of people who called me Bruce as well. There are still some people who call me Bruce, but it had gotten to the point that there were enough people that a lot of times when somebody would introduce me to somebody new, they would call me Dandy, or else turn to me and go, "Are you Dandy or are you Bruce?" You know, and so
Okay.
I never really had any attachment to Bruce. My parents chose were Bruce, Allen, and Glenn. My mother chose them because they were short and easy to spell, and nobody would make fun of them.
Oh.
Because she was Penelope,
Oh dear.
and her mother forbid her to let anybody call her Penny. She had to insist that people call her Penelope. So so she was like, "I'm not doing that to you. You know, you're." My middle name is Trowbridge. I was supposed to be Charles Grandison Trowbridge Tidwell, which is my great grandfather's name, because he had an only daughter, and then my grandparents had my mother as an only daughter. So I was like, the new patriarch of the family, and so I was supposed to be Charles Grandison, which I would love that. I think that's really cool.
Okay.
But my mother says that, my mother's like, no, he needs to be his own person.
Oh.
He's not the reincarnation of his great grandfather.
Okay.
But she ended up having to give me Trowbridge as a middle name because she told my great grandmother that she would do that, and not knowing that 6 months later she was going to end up pregnant and having a son. She said her thought was, well, I'll just quiet her down. I mean, Mumsy is sitting there sobbing after her husband has passed away about the idea that the family name is dying. And she's like, "It's okay. It's okay. We'll do this." And she thought, well, it's going to be years down the road. She will have forgotten.
I see. She hadn't forgotten.
She hadn't forgotten. But I don't. I don't mind that.
Okay.
I like the family history part of it.
All right.
But
What do you remember about if you can isolate your first conference from the other ones, what do you remember specifically about the first one?
I remember meeting Harry Hay, of course. I remember him being very intimidating because, partly just because of who he was to me, and his book and all this sort of stuff. It's like, oh my gosh, But also because John Burnside and I sort of got to become friends. I say that with some sense of modesty. We were never like really close friends, But I wouldn't really say that I was ever really friends with Harry, although when we crossed paths later he did remember who I was. But he was a socialist back in the 50s, a serious socialist, and so I think that was a big part of it is they tend to be it's like social justice and social change and everything is serious business.
Right.
And so he always sort of had that intimidating sort of serious side to him. It's like even when he was being silly and being a fairy, there was still this undercurrent.
Gravitas.
Yeah, gravitas. Yeah, he had enormous gravitas.
Do you remember how it felt to you? Was it like it is for a lot of people, a very release kind of feeling, or was it more of the same?
No, it was more the same because I had been going to the fairy gatherings for several years at that point, and which were at least as big, if not bigger, and far more. I would say far more cathartic. More, or maybe not cathartic, but
which was more cathartic?
The fairy gatherings. The gatherings were more.
Now, are you talking about Short Mountain, or are you talking about the
Short
Atlanta
Mountain
ones? Or
Short Mountain. The gatherings, not the Circle.
Okay.
The Circle was very small and intimate and laid back and homey feeling. But the gatherings at Short Mountain, there were huge, enormous rituals and stuff. With 100 guys, dancing around the maypole and stuff, and very, I guess, Dionysian, orgiastic. I remember one year at Short Mountain on Beltane when they danced around the maypole that somebody had brought just like a massive amount of marijuana, and they had made trays full of marijuana brownies, and so there were fairies standing out there in the field around the edges of the maypole dance, and people are like dancing by and snatching pot brownies off the tray.
Yeah.
So
do you remember if GSV felt therefore a little tame or a little too organized or a little?
I never felt it was definitely tame,
Mm-hmm.
but in a good way. I mean, certainly not in a negative way. I never felt it was too organized.
Mm-hmm.
It was what it was, and worked very well, and it was very good for what it was.
Mm-hmm.
But there was also, particularly in those first years, like I was saying about everybody knowing everybody, it's like, well, I will bring you into this because I think I'm certain it was your house. Not long after Raven and I became a couple, you were living in an apartment. I think it was over in Little Five Points, and you had a dinner party, and Raven brought me, and there was, like 5 or 6 other people. And after dinner, we all sat around, and I don't remember if any of it was for my benefit or not, but all of you guys got reminiscing and talking about the past, and and I don't know that it was necessarily focused on the sort of radical fairy side of things, but you had all known each other for 10 years or so, I guess, at that point, at least 6 or 8 or 9, and. And I'm sitting there listening to all these stories and realizing that it was like, I had heard people talk about families of choice in the gay community. And, I mean, intellectually, I knew what that meant. Mm-hmm. But I remember sitting there going, I married into this family. Mm. This is Raven's family, and and he's known all these people, and so in some ways, those first GSV gatherings were not exclusively directly an extension of that, but in a way they were an extension of that because it was all that same circle of people plus more people, mm-hmm. and so I think there's more of a feeling of almost family reunion-ish. Mm-hmm. And of course all the guys in the Atlanta Fairy Circle, as far as I remember, they were all going to the GSV conference. Of course, quite a lot of them went up to the Short Mountain conference mm-hmm. too, but I mean, gathering as well. But mm-hmm. so it was more like, it was like a family reunion. Mm-hmm. Going to Short Mountain was, I think that's, the mainstream pagans cast their circle between the worlds, and a Short Mountain gathering was 9 days of living in that liminal space between the worlds, because it really was, at the GSV conference, eventually we would cast circles and do these rituals and stuff, and in the moment they meant something, mm-hmm. but I mean by 3 hours later they didn't necessarily mean something. I mean, mm-hmm. the experience, and the GSV conferences definitely created their own space for the weekend. I mean, leaving and coming down the mountain and going back home was definitely a jarring experience of, wow, this is different. Mm-hmm. But not quite like being at Short Mountain, where it was like 9 days of almost indescribable dream world acid trip. Of course, several of those 9 days might actually literally be an acid trip, but right. But it was.
Oh yeah, because the GSV thing was a drug-free space, supposedly.
Yeah,
supposedly.
It was, and see that whole that all goes into that political thing. The difference between GSV is like so conservative and they're stuck up, and and it costs $100 to go, and and it's
no
all
drugs,
and it's all these well-dressed professional men from the city, except for those of us who did dress in drag, but
Do you remember at all any kind of strangeness around cliques of people who seemed to at GSV, you know, who you didn't feel like part of that family or that crew or any
I didn't.
undercurrents of all that?
I didn't.
No. Okay.
I think that I don't remember that being a huge issue. It may have been.
I don't either, but I just,
That sort of idea may have been, like I was saying, part of the impetus for having the small groups was that we were aware that if there were guys who had that experience, I think it had a lot. It was not at all about guys who were being cliquish as much as it was about, like I was saying, groups of guys who'd known each other for 10 or 15 years or whatever, who had all this past, who just sort of naturally sat down at a dining table and started being together, and somebody else, I'm pretty sure that almost everybody, if another guy had come up and taken a seat with him, they would have reached out to include him and not just sat there ignoring him. But at the same time, if you were up there more or less alone and you're standing there with your tray and you're looking at this table of people, you might have felt sort of like, well,
But you personally felt.
I felt
fine.
I always felt fine,
Okay.
But
Okay.
right from the beginning, I was right in the middle of things and knew everybody.
So, talk a little bit about some of your Raven-related memories that had to do with the conference. If you can tease it apart, I don't know that you can, but
I didn't really.
since we can't interview him, we're going to ask other people about
Right.
their conference-related memories of Raven. And then we'll talk about some non-conference memories too, but do you remember
I think.
things that he did in particular that were super interesting to you? Or
I think in the beginning, well, he was always very, very much into his Native American roots and the Native American spirituality that came out of that. And so that, was something that he sort of brought into things, at least in a somewhat laid back way. Not in a huge way, but that was one of the gifts he brought, I don't remember before I got on the planning committee, I don't remember that he really talked to me all that much about the conference being planned. I don't think it was a total surprise to me when he called me up and said, we're bringing Harry Hay to Atlanta and I want you to be there. I think he had already told me that it was in the works. But he did, I don't remember being consulted. Even the later when he wanted me on the planning committee, he said, we need to hear from the young people. The first couple of times, I don't think that he asked much. But then the first couple of times, they didn't realize it was going to be an actual thing. It was just a weekend retreat, Later on, I don't really remember. I don't remember how long he was on the planning committee before he sort of stepped back a little bit and let us, just start doing it ourselves. That's really hard to remember. Of course, the talking stick was something that he got. His Indian mentor, Native American mentor, Running Bear, or whoever, gave him that to give to us. And he brought that. And I do remember that he was the one who usually led the heart circles the first couple of years.
That's right.
He always led, that was always his
start
thing.
them off
To lead the heart circles, and and then came up with the talking stick. But that's all I really remember.
Okay. That's okay.
He had a tendency to be sort of quiet too. You know, I kind of think.
I don't remember that.
That he was quiet.
No. No, that's interesting.
I kind of think that maybe Ron was the one who actually was like
Mr. Organizer.
the sort of master of ceremonies sort of person. But
Okay. All right. Well, let's leave Raven for a minute and go back to the conference again. Do you have any particular memories about the conferences that are some of your favorite ones?
Yeah, well, there are so many, and looking back, some of them. I mean, the one about that crystal was way up there. Another one was either the fourth or fifth conference that we had. Two African American guys come. They were a couple as the keynotes, and they did a rebirthing ritual, and that was something else that I started out being sort of against, simply because that all came about because we started feeling guilty that we weren't being diverse enough, which I did. I was sympathetic to the idea that that it was a whole circle full of white guys planning this conference. It was mostly going to be white guys, and But the thing that I had a problem with was that doing the rebirthing ritual was a serious departure from the sort of philosophical teaching stuff that all of our other keynote speakers did. They came with a particular piece of this the larger gay spiritual puzzle, and presented it. And this was something that to me was, not even pagan. It was almost pop psychology. And the only reason that we were having them come to do it was because they were African American, and they were the only gay African American presenters that would remotely do anything that was, near to what we did at the conferences. And I just sort of felt like, well, that's not, even though diversity is important, that's not enough reason to have these particular people be that much of the conference. But anyway, it turned out, I went into it, and I had sort of read up on it a little bit and everything, and I thought of it as being this sort of cathartic experience. You do this rebirthing, and you go back and you confront all this negative energy inside of you, and you resolve it, whatever. And it was so weird because the universe was like telegraphing to me the whole weekend that I was in the wrong headspace. I got to the conference Friday afternoon, and the first small group, I went to my small group, and one of the guys said, "Dandy, come sit by me. I love to be beside you because your aura is a clear quartz crystal." And I was like, "Oh, thank you." I'm thinking, I didn't think about a clear quartz crystal, but okay.
Nice persona to have.
Yeah, exactly. I'm glad everybody else thinks so. And then when the rebirthing ritual thing started, we started off with like a double circle, and we were like going along to various people and sort of becoming increasingly, I don't want to say intimate, but I mean slightly intimate with them. Almost like the start of the what do they call that? The sort of spiritual sex.
Oh, body electric.
Body electric, yes, the body electric thing, But I mean, it wasn't going that far. But I guess it was just to sort of like build up this group energy. And so at one point, I'm sort of, briefly partnered with this guy, and all of a sudden he gets this just like totally shocked look on his face, and he whispers and he says, "Dandelion, your eyes just went sky blue, and when you blinked, they went back to brown again." And I was sort of like, okay, that's never happened before. Then I ended up partnered with Andrew Raymer, who I think was maybe our third keynote speaker or fourth keynote speaker, and he kept coming back. He's a wonderful, amazing, incredible man, which was just sort of totally by accident, at least on my part, and I was feeling a little intimidated because he was somebody else that, you know, I just sort of seriously had on a little bit of pedestal, you know. And so he went first, and the way it works is one person lays down and does the breathing ritual, and the other person just sits there and holds the space for them, you know, and takes care of them. And so he went first, since he had done it before, and watching him was amazing. It was like watching a dolphin swim through this spiritual energy or whatever, you know. But they still didn't get it. So all these little things are happening, and I'm still not getting it. And so I lay down and start doing the breathing, and these waves of like electricity are slamming up, you know. Well, they started out first just sort of vibrating between my head and down to my feet and back up again, and pretty soon they're just like slamming up and down. And I mean, it was to the point that I was starting to seriously be physically afraid because it was so intense. And so I stuck my hand straight up in there with my palms towards the ceiling, trying to, you know, like project this energy out of me before I spontaneously combust or something, you know. And so Andrew reached out and took my hands and folded them down on my chest and whispered, "It's all you, Dandelion. This is who you really are." And it was like I exploded out till I filled up the room. It was so amazing. It was like I felt the texture of the carpet on my back. I could feel the texture of the ceiling tiles. You know, and for, you know, several 30 or 40 seconds or a minute or something, I was like as big as this room, you know, before I sort of like back into myself. So that was pretty amazing. One of the rituals I did, the really problematic part was always the closing ritual, because we were always very conscious of the fact that we were building up all this energy, and people were having these major, some lucky people were having major life experiences, and then all of a sudden it's Sunday afternoon and you hop in the car and you drive down the mountain and you're back in the city, and you can't even put into words what's happened to you when somebody says, "How was your trip?" You know, and it's just like, oh my goodness, you know. So we always wanted the closing ritual to be something that would at least give people some level of actual real closure. You know, we knew we couldn't do everything, but, you know, do what we could. So that was probably one of the more like high church things that I did, that I had planned the whole thing where we had an abalone shell full of ashes for earth, and a conch shell horn for air, and this crystal bubble bowl that we filled full of water for the element of water. And then I have this Chinese bronze incense burner, little sensor thing with like little legs and all this enamel on it, really beautiful. And so that was fire. I went out to this magic shop and got these little flash powder sachets so that I can have a burning coal in the bottom of it and palm the sachet and go over the top of it, and it would make this huge fireball go up, you know. And so for the opening ritual, and then I there's like 4 acolytes, and so for the opening ritual, I would pick up each one of the things off the altar and do this whole incantation and, you know, call on the spirits and all this sort of stuff and give it to the acolyte, and they would go and cast the circle, you know, doing whatever with it, and then go to their appointed place, you know, and eventually it all closed. So for the closing ritual, we said, well, we're going to reverse it. So everybody takes their element and they go out and they're standing in their place. And so I do the whole closing thing and, you know, thank the element of earth, and, you know, so he eventually brings the earth back to me. And I've replaced the ashes. We used ashes from the fire pit, where every year we have a big bonfire, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And so I've replaced most of the ashes with glitter. So I hold the shell up, and you know, after I've done the whole thing, and blow the glitter out, you know, in this huge cloud of glitter, you know, and anyway, it blows back in my face. So now I have glitter and wood ashes in my mouth, and I'm like, okay. Okay, you know, the element of water, so they bring the element of water back. So we're going north, you know, west, and so they bring the whole bowl back, and there again, we dump most of it out, but there's like, you know, several swallows full, and so we're going to do the whole Catholic priest at the end of Mass thing, where, you know, you have to drink the wine, so anyway, he brings the water back, so I drink it. Well, water and wood ashes do not mix well, especially in the back of your throat.
Yeah.
So now I'm seriously choking, seriously hoarse,
Yeah.
and it's like, so I start in, you know, I do the, you know, thank the spirits of this house and everything, and call for the fire to come back, and the acolyte hands me the censer, and this voice somewhere out in the room says, "Uh-oh."
Right.
Because it's like, oh no, what's going to do with fire yet? And everybody died laughing.
Uh-huh.
Absolutely died laughing. And it was so wonderful,
Oh.
you know, because I just felt like, I just sort of almost raced through the whole rest of it. I'm not sure that I didn't even edit out a couple of pieces, because it was like,
Yeah.
that's it,
Uh-huh.
you know, it's done, you know.
Funny. Okay. Well, do you remember any keynote speakers with particular vividness? And I haven't asked you yet how many conferences you went to, or if you stopped going after a certain point.
Yeah, I did start going after a certain point. I think, well, James Broughton, particularly, I had already met him. He had already come to, I think he came to Atlanta the year before he did the conference, because they had a big movie. There's one of the art galleries did a big movie retrospective for him, so I had got to meet him.
Mm-hmm.
And so seeing him again was really wonderful. And in the meantime, well, I bought several of his books and had them autographed and stuff while he was in town. So, but before that, I really had no concept of him at all.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at least Harry Hay, I had already, even before Raven introduced me to his books and stuff, I was already aware of him as a leader of the gay rights movement and the Mattachine Society and all of that sort of stuff. I just wasn't quite so aware of what he'd done after that. I would say, well, Andrew. Definitely Andrew. You know, he was somebody that I had no idea about at all before he showed up at the conference. You know, and we became friends for quite a while. I wrote back and forth to each other and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Tom Spanbauer, but more as much his book as him.
Mm-hmm.
Although, you know, to be honest, he's sort of exactly my kind of a guy, so I sort of had a crush on him. And he never even knew that I had a crush on him. I tend to race to the opposite side of the room from men that I like in a totally self-defeating way. But
You may not be the only person you had a crush on, Tom Spanbauer.
you know, but
Okay.
I'm trying to think who else. I stopped going. I went every single year for probably almost 15 years.
Mm-hmm.
And stopped only because of financial issues.
Mm-hmm.
And then also I over I guess the past 6 or 8 years I've done an awful lot of moving around. I went up to Syracuse, New York for 2 years, and then like 2 years ago I moved away to Phoenix and ended up in Virginia Beach. And so there's, you know, my life has been pretty a lot of upheaval you know, but mostly it was just the times that I didn't go that I was in Atlanta, it was just that I couldn't really afford to go anymore. It's gotten, as I don't disapprove of the fact that it's gotten longer. I think for guys who can afford it, I mean, it was never long enough. I was never ready to go home when it was time to go home. Although I don't think after 4 days people are ready to go home when it's time to go home either. I wouldn't think. But between, you know, the mountain having to, their expenses going up and having to ask for more money, and the conference getting longer, it's, you know, it's become, you know, now I'm like the short mountain ferries. It's like, wow, it's, although I'm not judgmental about it, like I say, but it's definitely an expensive thing to do these days.
What about somebody who was not a keynote speaker, who you met at a conference? You had never seen them before, who either became important to you or you just remember them with fondness. Particular, another conference participant as opposed to a planner or a keynote or person. Did you encounter people either in your small group or some other way that you're really glad you did GSV just because you got to meet them? And the answer could be, I don't know.
I don't really know. I think there may well have been, well, you know, I would say that I definitely met people on the planning committee, but, you know, there were people like Mark Niskanitis who I met. I don't remember whether he eventually ended up in the planning committee. I don't remember whether he was there like at the first conference or not. I know I didn't know him. I didn't meet him here in Atlanta. I met him through GSV, you know. In terms of people that were just like totally not connected with the planning or anything, it's really hard to remember because there were so many people that I met through the Atlanta Ferries or through Franklin Abbott's Healing Circle, you know, or just socially here that I ran into up there. And then the people who ended up on the planning committee, I think some of them I didn't really know until they came to a planning committee meeting, you know, so it's to try to sort it all out and go, okay, this is somebody who this year I went up there and suddenly connected with this person. I think
the intention behind this question had to do with making sure that we didn't just focus on keynoters
and the important people.
So
that, I don't.
You know, if your life was greatly enriched, in particular by a particular person.
Not a definite particular person.
Now let's move to a subset of those people, not keynoters or whatever, and not Raven, people who aren't living now, that you particularly remember. Because you got to know them a lot, or you just admired them a lot, or whatever. Just somebody who has died since you met them.
Well, definitely.
Besides Reagan, we won't talk about him.
Exactly. Definitely Mark Niskanitis.
Okay. Just talk about him for a minute.
You know, he was a wonderful man. He was. I'm in the leather community, and he is as well. Mark Thompson, talking about people, I can't believe I forgot him. In terms of keynote speakers who became important, absolutely Mark Thompson.
Because of the leather connection?
Well, no, because of all of his books. He wrote Gay Soul and...
Gay Spirit, Gay Soul.
Yeah, there was... Well, he wrote, let's see, Leather Soul. He wrote 4 books about sort of gay philosophy and gay spirituality, you know, all of which are just absolutely incredible. I think it's... But the leather book that he wrote was incredibly meaningful to me personally. I won't go into all of that since that's sort of off the topic, but it was, you know. And he was very important, but it also, I can't remember what, he did a ritual, it was a small group thing. I mean, he did his like keynote address, but he also did I mean, not a small group thing, but a class, a workshop. Yeah, he did a workshop, and I don't remember how BDSM oriented his workshop was up there. It was very good, but it brought up the topic that he actually did a leather spirit workshop. And like I said, I'm sure he did not do the whole thing there because that took a whole weekend. But me and Martin and a couple of other guys eventually got him to come to Atlanta and do his leather spirit workshop, which was a whole weekend of things that built up to being like flogged for a whole hour, and we paired off into groups of 3, and so one person was beaten and the other did the beating, and then the other was the guardian of the space, to sort of coach the person through this, absolutely amazing. But Martin and I and who else was in that? Because there were like about half a dozen of us after that who tried to start a little leather spirit circle, leather fairy spirit circle thing or something here in town. Somehow we never could quite capture that energy again to make it work.
Okay.
But yeah, he was, that all of that, Alcott. Well, no, Al's still alive.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm forgetting
I know.
desperately important people that I'm going to hate myself
we're not
for
trying
later.
to get a list of important people. That's okay.
I mean people that are important to me.
Oh,
people
okay.
that in 20 minutes as I'm driving home, I'm going to be like, how did I
that's inevitable.
Yeah.
Well, talk a little bit more about Martin. He's somebody I know the least of the people you've mentioned. So, if there's a story about him that you remember or something that you thought he did really well, particular.
He was just a very, just incredibly gentle person. Somebody that I just always felt so good when I was around him. He just had wonderful energy. I think probably the story I just told about the whole leather circle thing and everything is probably the most like significant thing that I can remember. That's like a particular big thing about him.
Let's see. This is going to be really difficult to talk about, I think, because the topic is so big, but do you think you can isolate some of the things that GSV uniquely brought into your life, either into your spiritual self, or how if it weren't for GSV, you wouldn't be concerned about these things or whatever, what you got out of it mostly?
I can't really say that there was anything like any philosophical revelation or something, because most of it I sort of knew about before, things like Harry Hay and his writing and stuff I knew before I actually got to the conference. So I don't remember that there was anything. I mean, I had not read Tom Spandauer's novel before he got to the conference, but I can't really say, as wonderful and touching as it is, it wasn't a life-changing thing for me to read his book. I would say probably the biggest thing is the feedback that I got from other people and the way that it allowed me to step outside of my comfort zone and and become the MC and do all those rituals and do the monologues in the talent show, and as much doing them, but also as much that in doing those things it gave people an excuse to tell me what my place in the world was, to mirror that back to me, because I really had no self-awareness at all. Actually, there was a certain time, I mean, probably pre-GSV, that even pre-Radical Fairies, that it actually surprised me when some friend or somebody would say, "Oh, we were talking about you the other day," because somehow, and when I would be confronted with it, and I would be shocked by it, and then I would immediately go, "Well, I mean, I talk about people, people who know people talk about people," but at the same time, on some conscious level, I saw myself as invisible. I thought when I walked out of a room that nobody thought about me anymore, and that wasn't something that I beat myself up. Like I say, it was subconscious. I wasn't going, "Oh, poor me." When I walk out of the room, nobody thinks about me. But things like that would show me that I really did. And so, being in GSV and being able to have a leadership role, and and getting to the point where I think it was 1 year or 2 years that I was presiding elder, which is something that I really should talk about, would like to talk about. But, to get to the point where I was willing to do something like that and feel qualified and sort of worthy of doing something, that was huge. That's a huge thing that I got from GSV, that I don't think, I can't imagine I would have gotten anywhere else. I mean, not so much because there would not be anywhere else in the world that someone could do that, but I haven't been involved in any other groups or something that gave me those chances. The Radical Fairies would not have ever given me, just because it's a whole different social format. That those roles and those opportunities don't exist in the Radical Fairies. So, and that has been a very important thing, probably even more important than I could say.
Interesting. Well, one of our questions has to do with kind of contrasting and comparing the other kinds of gay groups that you have been a part of with GSV, and how they sit in your brain as different or similar. Is there anything unique about the way it works?
Well, absolutely. At least the way it used to work. I'm not sure how all the planning and stuff is done now. I have a feeling it's become a lot more linear and mainstream than it was for us. And but I mean, if that works for the people who are doing it, then that's fine. Yeah, other groups.
I mean, are you equally as comfortable in these other arenas that you have been in as this one?
Well, comfortable, yes. Are they as pleasant? No, they're not. I mean, the process of the planning committee was so much fun, and it was so easy, and it was pleasant to do it. I mean, until like I said, until the last month when we'd all go berserk because we were sure we hadn't done anything. But right up to that point, there was never a time in a GSV planning committee meeting when I was sitting there thinking, I want to chew my foot off in order to get out of this room. Or I want to dive.
And that does happen in other.
Or I want to dive across the table and grab that person by the throat and wrestle them to the floor. There was very little. There was a minimal amount of political correctness. I think, but that was sort of. For an LGBT organization in the mid-90s to not be absolutely totally angsting about, ethnic diversity and, was just a given. I don't know why we never had more African American people involved. We certainly tried. We tried desperately hard. I think a lot of it is cultural. I think a lot of it is that we were too pagan. I think the Christian churches conservative Christian churches, even for gay men who are not necessarily accepted in those churches, is a much stronger part of the identity of people in the African American community. But so that was something that was slightly, there were times when that was frustrating. But even that was never just like, it was very. The GSV planning process was very honest. It was very honest. We didn't get caught up. Even those issues were handled very honestly. I made jokes about it being the obligation of, gay people in the 90s, but we really cared about that. It wasn't a token thing, but it didn't become, it's like I remember there's a cartoon called Dykes to Watch Out For that was in the newspaper that was like bitterly satirical, just a razor sharp. And they did one where this committee for this sort of vague unnamed organization is sitting around this table, and the comment is, Ellen has agreed to have her leg amputated, so we will definitely able member on our committee. Which I think as I recall, the newspaper editorial column really lit up over that. That was like going a step too far. But I mean, I can remember being with other organizations, being in committee meetings that almost went that far, and it was just like, oh God, if I wasn't so committed to what we are doing, I would just, And, GSV, it worked. Everybody had integrity. Nobody, most of the time, all of us were willing to leave our egos at the door and work towards something, particularly after the first few years when we knew what we could create, and particularly when we started realizing, although that panic at the end never went away, it was always there, but when we started realizing how powerful the energy was around it, in terms of that idea that it's like, this is magic, it's going to work. Somehow we cannot sit back and do nothing, because it's not literally going to make itself, but at the same time, somehow, whatever we end up doing is just, it's going to work, So yes, I'm starting to forget what the question was.
That's okay. You said some interesting things about that. The feeling of...
Oh, you were asking about
over-planning, planning and all.
Yeah, you were asking about how it compared to other groups, And I think there again, even being there in the midst of it, all the guys who showed up, for the weekend, for the conference, I never felt like we were going through motions. This was something real, and that's something that even in other well-intentioned pagan groups that I was part of, wasn't always true. I mean, there were, I'll be a little gossipy and say there were individual people who, I can't even necessarily remember names. I probably could if I tried, but I won't. But who actually were bringing that other pagan New Age stuff with them, who it was also pretentious, and it's so, right. And it's not really all that much there, you just want to go, your astrology and your auras and everything are just, and the crystal that you're holding in your hand that's supposed to shatter all the windows in the building because it's so powerful, and it's like, it's just not, but core GSV was the exact opposite of that. It was always very real, and it was very real people who were doing it, and and sincere, very sincere. And then there was the other thing aside from diversity was the whole idea of it being a men's only group, and a gay men's only group, and whether that was right or not, and whether we needed to include women or not, and you know, how do you define, well, if it's a gay men's only group, how do you define a gay man? You know, if he was married for 40 years and his wife dies and he comes out, well, is he gay? You know, well, if he's still married but he thinks he's gay, is he gay? And you know, and that was something that that never became a huge problem. But I know for quite a few years that was an ongoing, simmering sort of thing, and I think it really, the whole how, you know, what's a gay man thing, you know, eventually we just settled it that, well, if he says it is, he is. But I remember in the beginning we had, you know, and that was one of those things where, you know, something that really was kind of awkward ended up being a very good thing in the end. That we had a straight guy who came and ended up his wife, I think, as I recall his backstory, his wife had wanted to go to like the women's festival or something, some women's only group, and so, you know, that he couldn't go to, and so their compromise was, well, you can go to Gay Spirit Visions, which is a men's only group. And so, you know, I rarely use these politically correct things like, you know, hetero privilege and stuff, but he really did come with this hetero privilege, and so he stood up in the closing heart circle and he said, well, you know, it's been a wonderful weekend and I've had a great time, but I just wish that you would consider doing more stuff to like address the issues of, I don't know that he came explicit, he may have even explicitly said, you know, address the issues of straight men and what we have to, and it's sort of like, well, we didn't because, you know, because you're a tolerated guest and it's really not all about you, you know. I mean, nobody said that to him, but that was, going back to the planning committee, that was a big learning moment to say, okay, this is why it's a gay men's conference and not a men's conference. Because this is a space for us to deal with our stuff without the straight men making it all about them, you know, and that was what we came to, was the idea of, well, if somebody says they're gay, then they're gay, but we're going to make it explicit enough that this is a gay men's weekend and we're going to talk about gay men's stuff, you know. Whoever you are, if you want to come and talk about gay men's stuff, then you are more than welcome, but you know, it's not going to be about your straight stuff. You know, you could go find, you know, somebody else to talk about that. And then the whole women thing, which I don't know. I mean, this is, you were probably, you may have been there, Cal, when this particular thing happened. But one of the sort of stories that was passed down to us on the planning committee was that in the late 70s, the part of the way that sort of Running Water started, or the group that, the circle of men that started Running Water started, was there was a group planning a gay and lesbian spirituality conference here in Atlanta, I guess in the late 70s, and the women announced that they wanted a women's only space, and I guess that was at a time when that was still a sort of contested thing, and so it was a bit of a shock, and the men sort of pushed back, and it's like, we're all in this together, and the women just, you know, en masse got up and stomped out of the room in protest and left all the men sitting there, and that was the conversation that happened after the women left, was like, wow, we actually have things to talk about, you know, this whole single gender space or whatever, really, you know, there's something to be done there, you know. And so that was something that did come up in the planning committee when the question of whether we're excluding women or not came up, was to say, you know, no, they need to go, we respect them and they need to go find their own space, you know. And if they want to come to us as organizers of our conference to get advice or whatever, learn from whatever experience we can offer them, then yeah, by all means, we'll have coffee, we'll whatever. But you know, and then that was something that Harry Hayes said too, in, you know, in his starting the Radical Fairies was that, I think it's sort of even there in Gay Spirit Vision, sort of explicitly, that he says, lesbians probably need something like the Radical Fairies, but they're going to have to go invent it for themselves, because I'm a gay man, I'm not a lesbian. I can only tell you what a gay man needs to have, and they need to go off and do it. So, but that was always, and that up till, I think right up till the present, is still something that is simmering there under the surface of, I think the last time was maybe a couple of years ago, when one of the women from the mountain wanted to participate on some level. I'm not sure I wasn't there, but and that sort of breathe those sparks back to life again. Of, are we going to let her? Is her feelings going to be hurt if we don't let her? But there again, I think it really. I don't think women come into a space the way that straight man did, with the idea of, I'm here, it's the whole world revolves around me. But I think it changes things. I do think it changes things.
Talk about this is a jarring change of topic, but tell us more about the presiding elder experience you had, and what that means.
Yeah, it's what happened. I said a little while ago that they gave the money from the conference to Ron to put into his charity, because it had to go for tax purposes. It had to be sheltered by a nonprofit, and then he gave it back. And so probably for the first 5 conferences, maybe even 6 conferences, that was the way it worked. That every year the proceeds were donated to his nonprofit, and then he gave us a grant. And finally it got to the point where it was like, okay, it's time for us to get our own nonprofit status. And I think we were getting to the point where, there were people who perhaps wanted to make donations for scholarships or something, and that was problematic, that we weren't actually a nonprofit and whatnot. So we decided to go through the whole process, which is huge. It's like a 3-inch thick 3-ring binder full of paperwork that you have to fill out. You send it through the government, and they look over it, and they send questions back, and you give them more information and all this sort of stuff. But we went through the whole thing. Al Cotton was working for Alston and Bird, the attorneys. He's like a legal secretary or paralegal or something like that. So anyway, when we finally got it all done, we had our nonprofit thing, and we had to sign it. And so he reserved one of the conference rooms in the IBM building on like the 30th floor, so that we would be halfway between the earth and the sky.
Okay.
And we went up there, and it was like it was like late in the evening, 9 or 10 or something, but after everybody was gone. And so we went in this conference room and did a little ritual. We couldn't have incense or smudge or anything because of the fire alarm system, but, and a thunderstorm came up right in the middle of it, obviously totally unplanned. And we signed all the documents to become a 501(c) thing. And I was one of the ones who signed it. Well, probably other than the tedium of filling out all the paperwork, the biggest problem was that to be an official nonprofit, you have to have officers. And of course, we were an entirely consensual-based organization. We didn't have officers. And I think we even, there wasn't any way to discuss things with the government, but I think we even went to them and tried to push back a little bit and say, but we're not a group that has officers, and they're like, there's a blank. Put somebody's name in a blank.
Yes.
It's like, okay. So we came up with the presiding elder and I think a scribe and I can't remember what name we gave the secretary. Something equally florid and improbable, you know. And, you know, to put them down, you know. And it turned out that, there again, having a presiding elder turned out to be a sort of a good thing. I think in a way. I mean, you know, it gave the group a sort of low-key pastoral, ministerial figure, you know. So anyway, that was the big thing. I mean, my being presiding elder, other than there again, the personal growth of just being willing to step into that role. I don't remember that anything all that enormous happened, you know, while I was the presiding elder. But yeah, the whole it's important to know the story about, you know, how that happened. You know, that we only have one because the government says we have to have somebody to.
So there's still a presiding elder then?
I think so. I'm pretty sure. Yeah, that there's still a presiding elder.
Right. Let's see. What are your speculations recently on whether or not we need a GSV anymore, or what function it could play in people's lives that may not be you or whatever?
I never knew there was speculation about whether we
I mean,
needed
do
one.
you have any?
Have
you thought
no,
about?
I've never thought about.
You know,
I've never thought about it.
continue?
I mean, I think
If it was free and the conferences were free, you think you'd be still going probably?
I think I think I would go back. I think you know, before I get to me personally, I'll say that it's breathtaking that it's lasted for 25 years. I mean, I'm just astounded. I mean, not because I didn't think. In one way, it's not a surprise that it did, because it always just ran like this train running down a track. You know, there's no reason to think that it would stop. But you know, in terms of any organization, but particularly I would say, you know, gay organizations or LGBT organizations, 25 years is a very long time for something to go on. Excuse me. But I don't think the world has changed all that much. I don't think there are other, at least not that I know about, other groups that are offering men a similar chance to explore the kinds of things that GSV explores. And I think spirituality is eternal. And you know, it's certainly true that the lives of gay men are much, much different today than they were in the early 90s. But even though, you know, our lots of things about our identity and our place in society aren't as contested as they were, people still need spirituality, and I think gay men still, you know, we're never going to be just like straight people. I really don't think so. You know, even when we get the right to marry, and even when it becomes popular to adopt children and move to the suburbs or whatever, you know, we will never still be just like straight people. We're just not, you know. So you know, is there still interest? Well, I don't know, but should there be interest? Yeah, I think there's still stuff, whether men out there in the world are conscious and hungry for it, I think they would get a lot out of it. For myself, if I could afford to go back again, I would. The only reason I stopped going was, well, money and the melodrama that was going on in my life at the time. I'm a little afraid to. Given the chance, I will, but I'm a little afraid to, because I've been away for so long that I'm not sure that it's still the same thing anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure, and I think that's fine if it's working for the guys who are going every year. Then I think whatever it is, if it works, then it's a wonderful thing. But I think I would go back expecting it to be what it was when I left, and it may not be that anymore. And it might be something new that I would find equally as wonderful and satisfying and valuable, but at the same time I might sort of slip into Kermage and the late old man mode, which I'm not quite old enough to be comfortable with, and be like, it's not like the
So
other.
you're afraid it might not be as wonderful as your memories of it in the past. It could have turned into morphed into something that's not.
I think. Well, my feeling is that, and I'm not involved directly. I mean, all I see is what percolates out. But and I don't want to be to sound judgmental, because I'm really not judgmental about it. But what I hear coming out of the planning committee and the planning process is that it has become a lot more linear and rational and, sort of parliamentary and niggly perhaps than it used to be. And so it makes me a little nervous as to whether that is sort of bleeding over into the actual experience of being at the conference. That would be a shame,
Okay. Okay, let's go back to the Raven thing for a minute, and just we can approach this any way that you would like to approach it. We can't interview him, so then there are a lot of people who've heard about him or know people who knew him, and so we want to use these interviews partially to just have little windows into whoever this guy was, and because of y'all's relationship, you have things that nobody else can know about him or appreciate about him. So I don't know how to formulate the question. Just what kind of person was this? And why did you fall in love with him? And what were some of his quirks, and what were some of the funny things you remember?
I think I fell in love with his energy. I mean, he was not at all unattractive, but he wasn't necessarily. My attraction to him wasn't we had a very physical relationship. I mean, my primary attraction to him was not, oh my God, look at that hunk, I want to hop in bed with, For one thing, I have a facial hair fetish, and he was clean shaven, and he showed me a picture of him from some years earlier when he had a mustache, and I begged him to grow his mustache back again for me, but he wouldn't. But, he just had an incredible kind of energy, and I'll say he was wonderful in bed. It was like I didn't have a lot of experience, but I did have some experience, and my experience up until that point was unenthusiastic. I remember the first time I ever had sex with somebody, I was like, that's it?
Oh dear.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's what everybody's like, I've waited all this time for that? Okay, with Raven, it was like that first night, it was like, oh my God, okay, this is what it ought to be, he was wonderful. He was very nurturing to me. He liked younger men. He was like, I guess, I can't remember exactly, but in his early 40s, and I was in my sort of early mid-20s, you know, and that was the kind of guys he liked, was little guys in their 20s. And so I think,
Did you ever come to understand what that was about?
no, not really.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I would guess that he really liked, you know, in the leather community, it's a daddy-boy relationship, and I still, you know, all of my important relationships have been daddy-boy relationships. At the time I met him, I had not gotten into that. I had no consciousness of that, but that was sort of the relationship we had. I think the sort of mentor aspect of things appealed to him. I think perhaps in a slightly dysfunctional way, I think he liked rescuing young boys. I mean, I was not in financial jeopardy, and you know, I had lost a job and moved back home with my parents, but then I had gotten another job, so you know, I had a safe place to live. It wasn't exactly great living at home with my parents at that age, but my parents were, they were fine. They were wonderful. But I think, you know, spiritually, personally, identity-wise, you know, I was still wandering around confused, and he
Saw that.
and you know, and was, you know, and was a wonderful teacher. I think he was very, very private. I remember feeling like that the first time that I walked into his apartment, just almost feeling like the whole apartment was an altar or something. You know, there was just this sort of pervasive spiritual energy into it. You know, that he really, to me, he was always very charismatic. Like I was saying about the first time I met him, and he walked into that party, and it was just like, wow, you know. And he eventually gave me a key to his apartment, which I think it was Gary Kaufman who was really shocked when he found out that I actually had a key to Raven's apartment. You know, that happened because, well, I would go over there on Friday evenings as soon as I got off work, and you know, meet him and stay until 10 or 11 o'clock Sunday night, you know, whenever he kicked me out to go to bed. And of course I had to drive all the way back down to Morrow and go to bed and get up for work the next day. And so one time he got hung up somehow, and so I ended up sitting out on his front steps for like an hour and a half or something, you know, before he could get home. And so he was like, no, this, you know, this is not working, you know, you need a key. And so he gave me a key to his apartment. And I even felt, even before Gary told me how amazing it was that he would do that, just the way that he gave me the key to his apartment. I mean, he didn't make a big deal out of it, you know, but just the way that it was done made me aware of the fact that this is something special, you know. He was very, I don't know even how to describe this. Well, he had a slightly unique way of looking at the world. You know, I remember him saying, you know, when, I don't know if it all the time or not, but, you know, when, you know, usually when you meet somebody, you're like, where are you from? What do you do? Right. You know, I remember Raven saying, what makes your heart sing? One Saturday morning, and I remember the trip. I don't remember what conversation led up to it, but you know, we would go out for brunch usually on Saturday mornings, and somewhere in the conversation something came up, and all of a sudden we were planning a trip to Athens, Georgia, because he wanted to see where I had gone to school. and where I had hung out. And so we went home and, hopped in the car and drove to Athens for the afternoon. And I took him all over Athens and, showed him the clubs I used to go to and my favorite restaurant and the dormitory I lived in. And, it was like, well, who else would care about that? But it, for some reason, and I guess, because of that sort of mentoring side of our relationship and my personal tendency to just sort of be the submissive partner in a relationship, I just sort of took things like that without questioning them. I didn't go, well, why do you want to go up there? Why do you want to do this? It was like, okay, if that's what you want to do, that's what we'll do. So I don't really know what that meant to him, but it was important for him to see that. He could be he could be very naughty. I mean, we went to down to Noonan, I think, antiquing down well south of town, and we were driving back, and I guess I don't know I guess we were in my car because I was the one driving. I can't imagine that he would have let me or even asked me to drive his little truck, so it must have been in my car. But anyway, we're driving back, and so, he was very frisky, and so he ended up unzipping my pants, and so, I'm trying to drive the car, and he's like, and this pickup truck pulls up next to us in the other lane on the expressway, and these redneck boys look down into the car and they realize what is going on. And luckily they were driving faster, and passing us, and they pass us, and I'm not really even thinking about them, until they get a little ways past us, and the truck veers off onto the gravel and back into and I realized that the passenger seat just looked down and just turned to his friend and told him what the two fags in the Chevette are doing. Yeah. And so I slammed on the brake. Not totally slammed on the brake, but I think that was a stick shift. I just pulled my foot off the clutch and immediately slowed down so that they had to keep going, because I was like, there's no way I can let that red pickup truck get behind us. But he was totally unique. I mean, it's easy to say that. I suppose almost everybody is really in their own way totally unique. But he was powerfully, stunningly unique. I remember his memorial service. There was a little boy young man, I guess. He was like 12 or 13 or something. I guess he was sort of a boy who played a piece of music on his flute that he had written for Raven, and he was the son of one of Raven's clients. He had a gardening business, and it was actually very, very well done. But the thing that really struck me was just that idea that, this man who was, this obviously upper middle class, well-off family who could afford to have a gardener come work in their yard, that their son had made that much of a connection with the family gardener that he would want to sit down and write a piece of music for him. And to reach across that class difference, and to reach across it, to reach out and touch a 13-year-old boy, and, probably the most antisocial, difficult period of a young man's life, was just amazing. Another time I was over there, I guess it was Friday, and, and he came home from work, and he said that, that he was coming down with a cold, and the lady that he was working for that day had called him in and made him a bowl of chicken soup for lunch. And I was sort of appalled, particularly because he was vegetarian,
Ah,
very strict
that's
vegetarian.
true. Yeah.
And I guess for me, I had very little experience with people who are vegetarian, but I also had another friend who was vegetarian who gets violently ill, physically ill, if he has any meat products at all. Even just like a little bit of chicken stock and sauce or something. So when Raven said that he had eaten a whole bowl of chicken soup, I sort of freaked out. It was like, oh my gosh, are you going to be okay? He said, which that was, one of the many lessons that he taught me. He said, I'll be fine. He said, never ever refuse a meal that's made with love. He said, you will never get sick if you eat something that was truly offered with love. And, and he didn't, he was fine. He sat there after a couple of weeks, maybe a month or so of us, starting our relationship. He said, I want you to cook dinner for me. And, so whatever you want, but I just want you to make dinner for me. So I did, and I was a good cook. Cooking was important in my family, so I was quite comfortable in the kitchen. So I made this Mexican dish. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was, Southwestern anyway, something. And, and we ate it, and then a couple of weeks later, we went out and it had all this cilantro in it, which I actually don't like cilantro, but at that point I wasn't really aware that I didn't like cilantro either. But I had to go to the farmer's market and get like a whole bouquet of cilantro, so I ended up putting even more in it than it really called for because
You had some.
it was there, yeah.
Yeah.
And so anyway, a couple of weeks later we went out to dinner to a Mexican restaurant, and he sent this bowl of bean dip back because it had a cilantro leaf on top of it and wanted them to send us some more. I was like, but, and it was the same thing. I was like, I'm so sorry, you should have said something. He said, no, it was fine.
Yeah.
Oh, he took me down when my parents went out of town, and he made me take them down to his house because he wanted to have sex with me in my bed.
Okay.
And and he said, and he actually said something about about the fact that I needed to have sex with somebody in my bed.
Oh, I see.
It was like, he was, but that's the way he was. His mind just, he had this really deep. I think everything was spiritual to him, in his own unique sort of.
Yeah.
Within his own world, yeah, everything was significant. There were not really many things that were not significant. I mean, he was flexible, like with the soup, because it was all about spiritual integrity. But at the same time, there were not many things. There's nothing in his house that wasn't absolutely very carefully considered and.
Right. I remember he liked for things to be intense.
Yes.
Everything.
Yes.
Why not have everything be intense?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's the thing. Yes, he was very intense. It's that thing that's like every experience needs
Very intentional.
To be, yes.
Yeah. That's right. Well, is there anything else that you could provide to somebody who might see this interview one day and wonder who is this Raven Wolf Dancer person that you want them to hear or know about him?
That I really felt like, and when I say this, I don't mean morally, because he certainly wasn't morally perfect. Although I can't really say that I saw many flaws in him, but I was young and my eyes were full of stars, and I thought he hung the moon and, made the sunrise in the morning. But I really felt like he was the kind of person that words like saint and bodhisattva were invented for, that inspired those things. Not because he was perfect, but because he reached out and touched every single person who met him.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just have this feeling that, you know, the checker at whatever grocery store he went to buy his food every week, you know, he wasn't a face that went by. He was somebody that somehow he connected with them, because it just seemed like when we went through the world together, he connected everybody that he had to pay attention to.
He did.
He paid absolute attention to them, and I think almost all of them on some level or other walked away remembering him because of that.
Beautifully put. I won't ask the other questions that I would ask about that, because they're just personal questions about you and Raven, and we need to finish. So, but thank you for that. If this is a project, we're trying to interview people who've been to K Street Visions, and especially the people who were there at the beginnings, or who've been a lot and have a lot of experience with different conferences. Are there people that you think we should definitely get to and not forget or overlook, as far as super important for one reason or another with Gay Spirit Visions? And you don't. I'm not expecting you to remember having, photographic memory of people. Right. We just will ask everybody.
I think probably, I would assume most of them are people that you probably already know. I would say Craig Cook. Okay. Is somebody which, if you don't have his.
He was our first guy.
Oh, he was your first guy. Okay, yeah.
And if you don't, that's okay.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think.
Like all the people that you've mentioned who are still alive, we'll get to.
And Bernhard Zinkgraf.
Okay, see, I would not have known. I don't know him, so I don't know.
Okay, yeah. He took over. He took over during the rituals after I stepped back from that.
Okay. And his name again?
Bernhard Zinkgraf.
Okay.
Zinkgraf.
I think I remember what he looks like, but I didn't know that was his last name. Okay.
I think Spell it. Huh?
Spell it again.
Zingraf. And I think I can probably come up with his email address.
Wonderful, because I don't think we have it.
He doesn't live here anymore. I think he still lives up in Washington, D.C. He moved up there.
Okay.
Let's see. Who else? I'll think about it over the next couple of days.
Okay. All right. Well, have we overlooked some part of this ball of wax that you wish we had gotten to, or you expected us to ask you about, or whatever? Because we're done with the questions.
Okay.
Yeah. We want to be sure that you don't go home thinking, well, gee, they didn't even go over here and ask me about this.
Right.
And this is part of the whole thing why I care about it. So.
No. No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Not really.
Okay.
It's just. I think it's something that you can't really put into words.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think we've sat here and talked about it a lot, and probably other people will talk about it a lot, but at the end of it all, if you haven't been sitting, in that final art circle on a Sunday afternoon, you just haven't been there. But
Sure. You're right. Okay. I'm going to turn off the tape recorder.